Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last panel of this afternoon's program at Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Somini Sengupta. I'm the international climate correspondent for the New York Times. I am really delighted to learn from our panelists today. Luisa Palacios, you're a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Just recently, you completed a 2-year period on the board of directors of Citgo Petroleum Corporation. You know a great deal about Brazil and the world. Monica de Bull, yeah, did I get that?
You
okay.
did.
You told me to ignore everything other than that you're a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. You've been there since January 2017, and joining us online from Kigali, Rwanda, where it's past dinner time, well past dinner time. Thank you for joining us, Natalie Unterstell. You are currently serving as the president of Talanoa, a climate policy think tank in Brazil. Thank you for being with us so late in the evening. We're going to have a conversation that I hope will be rich and engaging for all of you. We'll open up the floor for questions in about a half an hour, so please prepare some. And then it will be my pleasure to close our session and invite you to a cocktail reception. So I want you to both open up by really telling us about Brazil being under the spotlight between now and COP30, right? We've got a year and a half. What does President Lula and his administration have to show between now and then?
Okay, I'll begin. I think several things, but notably, I mean, we have seen in 2023 a very, very significant reduction in deforestation. That's very welcome, of course. It is something that we would have very much liked to see earlier. Unfortunately, that did not happen. But that is something that needs to continue and actually needs to accelerate, because the goal that we need to reach, we are at a point where the goal has to be zero deforestation. We can't have it anymore. And the scientific studies that we've seen and things that have come out even recently, there was a very good study that came out in Nature. It was actually the cover of Nature a couple of weeks ago by some Brazilian scientists discussing precisely what is the state of the Amazon, what is the state of the art in research in analyzing Amazon tipping points. So this idea that, once you're past a certain threshold of deforestation, the rainforest can no longer sustain itself and it automatically starts turning into savanna. This paper actually was extremely good because it discussed the fact that there's not just one tipping point. There are several, because you need to understand the rainforest as a connected web, as a sort of a connected, it's an ecosystem, but it's a web of ecosystems that are interconnected. And in fact, when you look at the data, what you see is that in some areas of the rainforest, the tipping point, we're already past the tipping point. So the rainforest is actually emitting more carbon than it is capturing, which is not what rainforests are meant to do. And in other areas, there's still some resilience. So what I believe President Lula needs to come up with, based on the science, based on these studies, is how is it that we're going to get to, yes, the zero deforestation point, but at the zero deforestation point while maintaining the resilience that is still present within the Brazilian Amazon. This is critical.
Okay.
And he needs to lay out a clear policy plan for us to get there. We're lacking that
is
part.
His main challenge. Zero deforestation by the time the climate conference gets underway next year and a plan on how to get there. Natalie, what's your take on this?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's such a great honor to be with you and to answer this particular question, which is exactly the work that we do at the moment. So I absolutely agree with Monica that deforestation, tackling deforestation, is at the bare minimum of what Lula needs to deliver. We cannot expect deforestation to go to zero next year. I think that would be, well, not a dream, but it's not realistic to expect that to happen in 1.5 years, especially after what happened in Bolsonaro's years. But yes, there are good chances that deforestation will go down by next year in the Amazon. And of course, the direction is already set. The Lula government is already committed to zero deforestation by the end of this decade, and there is a plan underway. What I am concerned are the other bits of the climate policy, which are not in place. So for instance, when we talk about the race to zero, the race to net zero, we talk about the energy. And let me be clear with you, there's no transition happening at the moment. Actually, what is happening is that we are doing quite the opposite. We are adding more gas, and we are striving to become the 4th largest oil producer by 2030. So this is one very big thing. And of course, it's not possible to change course from now to 2030 because it's been contracted with trillions of investments already. However, we need to discuss what's going to happen beyond. And this is exactly the conversation that Lula is opening space to occur, but not necessarily has committed to a real transition, at least not yet. So we have this very big elephant in the room, which is visible and needs to be discussed. And just to add to that, there are 2 other points which are somehow related to this conversation. One is the issue of adaptation. Brazil had a very difficult 2023, impacting agriculture, impacting communities, impacting energy as well. So we cannot get rid of it. And Brazil is still doing everything business as usual, climate as usual, government as usual. So it's a very important piece to get ready for COP30. And finally, as mentioned by Monica, we need a policy. Currently, there's no policy. There's only a discourse on the ecological transformation plan, but we can barely call it a plan because there are no instruments, there's no governance, there's no coordination. So anyways, we need to go beyond the discourse, which is creating, some flanks for progressives. But in the end of the day, what matters is what is in paper, codified, and can be implemented.
I want to come back to 2 things that you mentioned, the energy transition and adaptation. But first, I want to ask you, Luisa, top challenges facing Lula between now and COP.
So I think one of the things that was discussed in the last panel was the tensions that exist in foreign policy. Those same tensions exist in energy transition, right? And so particularly exactly because what was said, Brazil is an oil producer. Not only is an oil producer, it's a huge oil producer and exporter, is the most important oil producer and exporter in Latin America. And so it is also in the spotlight. So how does an oil producer and oil exporting country do energy transition? And to me, that is once you get into COP, the spotlight is going to be on Brazil, exactly on all of these kinds of issues. But it's not only on oil and gas and refining, it's also on biofuels. Because the energy transition, although we think just about reducing carbon emissions in the energy sector or carbon emissions in general, the energy transition is coming with a whole set of, it's a bigger agenda. It's about biodiversity. It's about waste management. It's about many other things. And so Brazil has a very, very dynamic bioenergy industry, but it's an industry that also gets into, I think it's in the spotlight because of the food versus fuel type of debate. So Brazil is, I always use this phrase, is an energy powerhouse in every single way you can think about energy. It's energy supply and energy demand, production of energy and energy uses. But it's also a very big country in terms of the high emitting sectors in the industry, in iron ore, in mining, everything that you can think about, Brazil is big on. And so it's one of those places, because the energy transition is not a one size fits all model. To me, it's a very important place from the global South on how you can actually do energy transition in a way that is orderly, but that you do it, right? And so how do we do this in the global South? How do we take care? What does just energy transition mean without this meaning an excuse for inaction? And so all of those things are coming in together. And as the UAE found itself, Brazil's going to be in the spotlight for everything, for deforestation, for oil, for biofuels, for everything.
The biofuels also, of course, bring some deforestation questions as well, right? You said, Natalie, that Brazil had a very tough year in 2023. Can we just understand what are the main climate risks that Brazil is facing right now? Because that'll help us also understand what the energy transition can look like, might look like. Monica, I think, you in our email exchange pointed out the crucial fact that Brazil does not have an emissions footprint really from its electricity sector, because its electricity comes mainly from hydro.
Yeah.
But doesn't climate change also pose some risk to hydro? What are the key climate risks facing the country in its different regions right now? Who wants to take that one first? Monica, you want to take that one?
I can
Go
begin.
for it. Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a critical point, because one thing that we have already seen as a result of deforestation, and perhaps this speaks to Natalie's point on 2023 and how difficult a year it's been. 2023 was a year where we saw profound droughts affecting various parts of the country. And in part, this is because, in part it's El Nino, and in part it's deforestation, because the Amazon, as all rainforests do, generates its own rain necessities, right? Not all of it, but most of it. And the deforestation itself, once it reaches a certain point, and the Amazon arguably has already reached that point, starts to affect the hydrological cycles or the rain cycles throughout an entire region. It's not just concentrated on the Amazon, but extends further down into South America. And arguably, you could say it also extends a little bit into Central America. So some of the issues that we've seen, for example, in the Panama Canal, and I've written a piece about this, the drought in the Panama Canal that's currently affecting it badly, part of that may be a result of these changing hydrological cycles.
So deforestation is itself changing the weather in the region, even as climate change and El Nino is also changing the weather.
And then it starts to pose these problems, because it poses problems for the hydro sector. It poses problems for public health. Brazil is going through its worst dengue outbreak in recent history. And
that's because of?
That's because of warming temperatures, and it's because of the changing patterns of rain cycles, but it's climate change. It's all climate change related. And we have already seen how these vector-borne diseases with climate change are affecting different parts of the globe. They're not just, where they used to be, they're going everywhere else. So, all of these issues are interconnected. All of them pose a challenge. And in the end, with Brazil in the spotlight, with Brazil having the largest rainforest in the world, responsible in one way or another for all of these issues that are playing out at the same time, these questions are going to come up. So what do we do?
Natalie, do you want to talk about the main climate risks facing Brazil?
Yeah, sure. I think there are at least three things that are important here. One is what Monica was explaining in terms of the rainfall regime, which is changing already, and that affects our hydropower based power matrix, right? We have some indications that for 2040, Brazil will we'll have a dramatic change. Well, it's occurring already, but by 2040, the projections are that, for instance, areas where we have today Belo Monte Dam or other, dams in the Amazon, they will have at least like 30% less, I forgot the name, they will have less water flows by then. So imagine if today we rely on that type of energy, that's no longer the case. So this is a very, very important topic. There are these other two factors, as Monica pointed out, El Nino and the deforestation, which are accelerating, contributing to this. But overall, there's a very basic component here. The other point, which is related to the rainfall regime, is agriculture. So the fact that we are seeing already longer dry days and drier conditions is certainly affecting the south of Brazil. Has suffered a lot in the last years, and the Midwest, so the soy producing areas, they are projected to be extremely affected. So that has prompted some debate around, should we continue doing soybeans in Mato Grosso, for instance? Should we start, having other things? So this is important. And finally, the landslides and the floodings are certainly the most common threat that we experience in Brazil. And of course, this is becoming even more difficult to deal with, because this is now compounded with things that we never heard of, such as cyclone bombs happening in the south of Brazil. There is a famous singer in Brazil that say that the country is blessed by God and beautiful by nature, because we never had the type of things, hurricanes, cyclones, and suddenly we are having to deal, especially in the south. So the economies are not prepared for that. People are not prepared for that. So there's a wholesale change in the way that we will have to deal with risks overall. And of course, there's a lot to do.
Do climate risks pose a challenge for the energy transition decisions that Brazil has to make?
Absolutely. And it's not only Brazil, it's actually many countries that depend on hydroelectricity. In the case of Latin America, some of them are like really, really dependent. And we're talking about a region that on average has its power sector depends, it's right now about 60% renewables, but most of that, of the 60% is 45% is hydro.
Right.
And so in the context of climate change, that poses really significant, I think, challenges about how to continue to be renewable, the countries in the region, not only Brazil, what the solution has been, okay, let's put much more renewables. And I think the region, and particularly Brazil, has been very, very successful at auctions that bring about non-hydro renewables. So the region is actually one of the best in the planet. I always use this with students. Latin America is where the rest of the planet wants to be. So Latin America in general has a very green electricity mix. It is true that that doesn't mean the energy matrix, but power is the most important component of the energy matrix. And so, so in the case of Brazil and other countries like that, Canada is also super dependent on hydroelectricity. So this is so how do you deal with a power grid that is now integrating more and more renewables, which are intermittent, and then you have instability in your base load? And so some of them have resorted to increasing at least the availability of natural gas.
Right.
So what that has meant is that the energy transition right now feels like energy addition. It doesn't feel like energy transition, because the energy transition is about breaking the 80% of share that fossil fuels have over the production of energy. But that breaking up is leading first to a ramp up of renewables, and you can see it in the data. The data is telling you that every new source of power electricity, I said 70 to 80% of new power electricity is renewable. So we're heading in the right direction there. Right. Just that we're not retiring anything else, because climate change, the irony of this as well, is that it leads to higher energy demand, because heating the planet means more demand for cooling. And that demand is exactly in emerging market and developing economies,
Including in Brazil.
including in
Yeah.
Brazil, that have the least resources to deal with the effects
Yeah.
of climate change. So it's actually, you are running just to be at the same place.
Yeah. So is Brazil doing enough to attract investment in renewables, to, promote renewables?
This is a COP28 ended with many different things, including transitioning away from fossil fuels,
yeah.
but also scaling up renewable
Right.
clean energy technologies, particularly in emerging market and developing economies, because this is where the huge gap is. So emerging market and developing economies in general have not seen an increase in clean energy investments. We have seen a significant increase in clean energy investments. It's just that it's going to China and advanced economies. However, I will have to say that Brazil last year was among the top 10 destinations for clean energy technologies. So they're doing something right.
And by clean energy technology, do you mean
Renewable electricity,
solar?
Solar and wind.
And wind,
That's
offshore?
offshore as well. But the second generation, so those are the mature technologies.
Yeah.
There's you don't really have to subsidize that because we have already
The prices have come down.
prices are commercially possible. The rest of the clean energy technologies are more difficult. But I have to say that what I've seen so far from Brazil, even though it might not feel that the country is doing enough relatively to the rest of the emerging market space, it is actually really trying to put all the ecosystem in place to attract energy investments, not only in the more mature renewable electricity technologies, but also in other places. So it does seem that they're doing something right from the point of view of seeing an increase. The trend is the right place. You're not anywhere close where you need to be.
I want to ask you one other question before I open up the floor for questions. We're talking about energy transition. Is there a need to also talk about an agricultural transition for exactly some of these reasons you were, bringing up? Brazil is a very important agricultural commodity producer. That is largely the reason why there's been so much deforestation in the Amazon and in the Cerrado. So is that discussion going on, and what are the sort of, economic and political challenges in having that discussion?
So there's a huge political bottleneck in that discussion, because when you look at the composition of the Brazilian Congress at the moment, there's a large group of Congress members who have very close ties with the agribusiness sector, with the agricultural sector. And what we have seen consistently over the past few years, but in particular it intensified last year, is that pieces of legislation that have been put to Congress in order to improve, the conditions under which agriculture is conducted, to improve them in a way that's climate friendly and environmentally friendly, they're getting shot down. So for example, we had a piece of legislation on regulating very strictly the kinds of pesticides that can be used in crops, because we know from scientific research, again, that pesticides, some types of pesticides, actually contribute to climate change when you use them. And this piece of legislation in particular was to have been a very important one, but it was completely shot down and it never went anywhere, precisely because of this very strong agribusiness caucus that is in Congress. So we are seeing a lot of political pushback within the Brazilian Congress on measures that are critical to advance on the agenda and to actually get to the point that Luisa was talking about, to not just running to stay at the same place, but actually running so that we can strive ahead. There's a very big political bottleneck there.
Natalie, you were shaking your head when I asked the question. What's your take on this?
Look, as deforestation starts to go down, agriculture and land use are going to become the most important source of emissions for Brazil. And since Brazil is also committed to net zero, I think this is not an optional question. I think it's an imperative, right? But we need to build a political economy around that. As I mentioned in the initial comments today, the Lula government is opening space for a conversation around transformation, around energy transition to happen. We still don't have this political economy, this political space to do this conversation, but that doesn't mean nothing is going on. For instance, there are 50 shades of green and brown in the agriculture sector in Brazil, and there are good things that I think we need to elevate, and we need to, again, create space for a progressive conversation on this.
I mean, I'll ask it really bluntly. You know, does soy cultivation have to stop expanding?
Well, I guess it depends, right, Natalie? I mean, if it's done in a way that is sustainable, and in many ways, some of the soy sector has moved in that direction, then no, not necessarily. I mean, we have seen some soy production that these days now uses a lot less land than it used to. And at the same time, it recycles that land use for other purposes. So we see, you know, recycling of crops. You grow soy one season, then you turn to corn, and then you might even turn to cattle ranching because, you know, it helps to sort of reinvigorate the area for plantation and so on. So there are things like that that are going on, but there could be more, for sure.
Let's open up the floor for questions. We're going to take questions from our virtual audience as well as from here. So I saw a hand going up here first.
Hi, Will Freeman, Council on Foreign Relations. As Brazil has emerged as a major consuming country for cocaine and also a transshipment point for cocaine to Europe and West Africa, I've seen more and more reports that drug trafficking organizations are contributing to deforestation in the Amazon. So I'm curious if you can assess how much of the deforestation and environmental degradation that we're seeing is driven by that type of activity and by organized crime writ large, compared to the deforestation driven by agribusiness? Are we talking about a drop in the bucket, or is this really a serious threat to the future of the Amazon? Secondly, now we've heard earlier today that the Lula government has achieved a surprising and rapid reduction in deforestation rates. Is the government so far also targeting those organized crime activities that contribute to Amazon deforestation? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
I can take that. Well, the statistics we have point to a 99% of illegal deforestation in the Amazon. So we are talking about very well organized crime in the region. I don't think we can say this is driven by drug trafficking. I think it's an association of different crime, you know, organizations. And of course, they understood that they could use, you know, land grabbing as a source of revenue too. So there is a combination going on. And at the core of the Brazilian command and control or the law enforcement policies, precisely this idea that they are combating the agencies, they are combating crime. And I think they have the tools, the toolbox is there. We have very competent intelligence people working on this. So we are seeing more and more also the Ministry of Justice involved and, you know, the federal police. So there is a very interesting and collaborative governance around this, which is, I think, well equipped to deal with this. But that doesn't mean it's easy, right? Because this business is so well organized, so well funded, that it became much more difficult after Bolsonaro, especially because our frontiers, they became much more permeable too. So we cannot guarantee that what Brazil knows to do in terms of enforcing the law will continue to work in 3 or 5 years. So maybe we'll have also to rejuvenate the way that we combat these types of crimes.
And just to add one point to what Natalie was saying, we need to keep in mind that, you know, the Amazon, to a very large extent, is kind of a no man's land, literally. The distribution of property rights and land titles and so on is extremely difficult. So you have areas of the Amazon that are so-called public land, but because there are no land titles or anything like that, you know, the scope for illegal activities in the sense that Natalie was talking about is immense. It's huge. And that problem on its own is a massive problem because look at the size of the Amazon. The Amazon corresponds to nearly a third of Brazil, right? So it's a huge area. And so we're talking about, you know, being able to impose these property rights that in a massive area and actually being able to enforce them, because imposing isn't enough. You need to enforce, right? So it's a very complicated issue.
No,
Teresa.
I was just going to say that part of the challenges of the energy transition in emerging markets and developing economies like Brazil is that it requires actually significant state capacity because it requires a lot of so everything that you produce, you now have to show not only that you say you produce sustainably, you have to show it, which means that people have to trust that your certificates are correct, that you indeed did not deforest in this land when you produce that specific product. So it comes with such a demand for the same institutions that are lacking in these places that I think that to me, the issue is, yes, it's an issue of finance, but more that not only of finance, it's an issue of institutions. And so deforestation, there's a academic research on why exactly is it that all of these nature carbon sinks, as we call them, are exactly in emerging market and developing economies. It is because of a lack of state. Because if you had a very competent state, I'm not sure if that's, I just thought it was interesting, the idea that it is exactly in developing countries where you continue to have this pristine forest because development has not reached. But now we need to keep them there. But how do we keep them there in a way that that does not preclude the development from those countries? And so issues like the voluntary carbon markets that people are, you know, have such an issue with that. To me, this is so important because we do need to create institutions where there have never been institutions. The government now making sure that it's pristine forests where there's no man land actually are policed. It demands so much of that is not yet there. The ecosystem, it needs to be there.
Yeah. We had a question in the back, gentleman in the back.
Oh, Otaviano Canuto, for the Center for the New South, former VP World Bank. 2 points. Oh, fantastic discussion. Very good. I felt the absence of any reference to key critical minerals, which is an important dimension of the green transition. And you know what? Recently, I saw a presentation by Simon Evanet from the Global Trade Alert, where he depicted the configuration of key critical minerals in many places of the world. But Brazil doesn't have one official map. The Chinese have.
For Brazil.
Yeah, they do have. But I asked my colleagues on the government and so on, and nobody knows exactly. There is a hint, there's someone. Anyway, this one dimension that matters, among other reasons, because of the ESG risk associated with the production of those critical minerals. So I would have. And the other point is the following. It's more of a provocation, which is the following. Even the most optimistic scenarios for the road to decarbonization, the ones assuming, you know, ambitious pledges and so on, depict only a gradual elimination of fossil fuels, right? No one can imagine that you may have an abrupt change from night to day. And there are many reasons for this, different costs and so on. So for the next 30 years, the residual demand for fossil fuels will still be there. And they established the limit to which we can consider the decline of use. My point is that the following: you cannot simply measure or consider the production of oil of Brazil in itself. You have to put it in this context. There is a market. It's hopefully, if everything goes all right, damn the oil producers. We'll have to face a shrinking demand. But measure and gauge the Brazilian production of oil without taking this into account, I think is not appropriate. That's the point.
I want to come back to that point, at the end, but I think the critical minerals question is part of the energy transition conversation, right? Does Brazil have the natural resources for the new green economy, and is it trying to develop those in good ways or bad ways, in your view? What are the challenges there? What are the risks there? Or does Brazil have the old gray economy, natural resources only, and must stick to that?
I can say a few things
Okay,
and then
then I
pass
can-
on to you.
okay.
So if we look at, for example, one of the areas that I find most fascinating, and that's been in development in Brazil, and I'm sure Luisa knows more about it than I do, green hydrogen. For green hydrogen, you need these machines called electrolyzers, which basically are going to, take water and separate two hydrogen molecules from an oxygen molecule. You can do that by using certain types of critical minerals, which are not found in Brazil. And those would be the more acidic electrolyzers, so a certain kind. Or you can do that with more alkaline electrolyzers, and those would use precisely the kinds of minerals that you find when you extract iron ore. So those are nickel and other things that are within that group of alkaline metals. And those Brazil does have. Brazil is beginning to develop a green hydrogen industry. Doesn't have regulation, still needs to regulate precisely what green hydrogen is going to be. But as Otaviano was saying, and I think Kelly too, China has these things mapped out for Brazil. They know where the reserves of alkaline metals are and what sorts of electrolyzers you can build. Brazil needs to get a grasp of its own of where its capacity is to do these things.
There's two minerals that are critical for the energy transition. One is copper and the other one is lithium.
Yep.
Cobalt, nickel
Cobalt
also
also,
matter, but those two are critical.
Yep.
Critical minerals. But Latin America produces 40% of the copper that is produced in the planet, and has about 36% of the resource of lithium. So that's not Brazil. It's Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. Those are the three, what we call the lithium triangle. The Chinese are highly invested in the lithium triangle, in part because the way you think about this is that the upstream part of the sector is the raw materials, but all the refining capacities in China. And so the issue is, yes, Latin America, and there are reserves of those critical minerals in Brazil, not so much copper. And there are the concentration of each of these minerals and the concentration of the refining capacity is a problem. If not just because of geopolitics, is that just dependence, such high dependence is a risk management issue, right? And so I think that what is happening with critical minerals is that how do you do this sustainably? Because it's we're not going to just switch from one extractive resource to another and then do other types of harms to the earth. So the energy transition is coming, as I said, it's not just carbon emissions, it's coming with a whole set of sustainability things around it. Even the hydrogen, how the carbon intensity of the hydrogen, the waste, everything. So it's a tough one, right? And so, and more importantly, it's the not only the biodiversity, the water usage around it, but the human rights component in a lot of this. So that makes investing such a difficult part. Even if you really, there's a lot of impact investors and energy transition investments, they don't go to mining. It's just too difficult. And so therefore, there are concerns about just trying to develop mining in the US, the same kinds of issues. This is tricky, this is
Mhm.
difficult, these are
Yeah.
trade-offs because the energy transition is not cost-free. So in order to, so people want to invest only on the downstream. You want to invest in electric vehicles, in batteries, you just don't want to be on the other part of the more difficult processing of
Right.
those minerals.
I mean, the energy transition is not cost-free. That lesson was made very clear to me a few years ago when I went to Chile to write about the lithium mining and the environmental risks and the concerns that came up. Do you want to add something, Natalie, on the critical minerals question?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I really would like to see it as a part of the climate policy in Brazil and not only as a sectoral policy. We just published a recap of the existing policies applicable to critical minerals as of today. And they are very conventional, very traditional in the sense that they're just replicating what the sector always does. And I think there are goods and bads in that, but I think we need to look beyond. And one of the challenges that lies at the heart of this discussion in Brazil is that well, there's a gap in knowledge, as was mentioned, but the things we know or the areas we know that could be explored, they are overlapped with protected areas and the ocean. So we will have to work around that on marine spatial planning, on some other forms of negotiations, because we need to deal with that piece. And the other piece is also, should Brazil prioritize having this, exploring this? Should we maybe work on green chemistry and other alternatives? So I think we really need to broaden the discussion and break the sectoral silo where normally these things are discussed and defined.
I want to remind everyone that this meeting is on the record. I do want to put out an invitation to our audience on Zoom to submit a question. In the meantime, there's a question back.
Hi, Shannon O'Neill from the Council on Foreign Relations. We've been talking a lot about what Brazil can do at home for its green transition, but I would love to take you all to Brazil's role in sort of global green diplomacy. And so Brazil has long had a history here, right? 1992, the Rio Summit started off the whole UN FCCC process. They were a big player in the Paris Agreement, and they're going to host the next COP30. We know that the COP process has kind of lost a little bit of its luster over the last few years. I'd be really interested in sort of where you see Brazil, either in the COP, what they're planning, or in other formats. What can they do? What are the areas where you could see real progress? Or what are the limitations for Brazil as a leader, given it is doing this kind of all of the above energy strategy, and it has, it is a big emitter. It does have some of these challenges that we've just been talking about. How do you really see it playing on the international stage?
Well, taking this to an area that we haven't talked much about, but which is very, I think is a critical issue that we often don't talk about enough with climate change. I think where Brazil could make a lot of strides, and I'm not at all positive that they're going to move in that direction, but where it could is precisely in the area where climate change touches on public health. Because not only does Brazil face the challenges posed by climate change with the sort of tropical diseases that it sees and that it's seen more and more of, as I said before, we're in the middle of the worst dengue outbreak we've ever had, but it has the capacity to develop drugs and to discover new drugs because of the amount of biodiversity that exists. And this is an economic activity that can happen without necessarily damaging the environment. So, taking a cue from what Luisa was saying, Luisa was making the point, look, there are all these issues in energy transition, and we think of energy transition as something, irrevocably good, but it does have a carbon footprint. We can't ignore the fact that it has a carbon footprint. Well, here's something that doesn't necessarily have to have a carbon footprint in the public health arena, and which should be of interest to everyone, because not only are these vector-borne diseases moving elsewhere on the planet, I mean, we here in the US are importing, malaria kits and dengue kits and chikungunya kits stuff that we never did before. I was looking at this data the other day and I saw this ramp up from 2019 onward. We never had to import this stuff before, but we're doing it. The European Union is doing it too, because, guess what? Dengue has popped up in Belgium, So given this, the placement of Brazil in the international stage and the sorts of things that it has at its fingertips, it really should be a player that unites the climate change issue with the public health issue, because they're intimately connected. Are they going to do that? I don't think so.
Natalie?
Well, I have a list of 3 things. One is the NDC diplomacy. So really, I think it lies with Brazil, the responsibility and the opportunity to set the tone on the nationally determined contributions this year. So I think that's very important, because the Paris Agreement is based on this concept of raising ambition over time. So whoever's, elevates the targets, but also the whole policy will probably influence others to do the same and even to go beyond. So this is one thing, and I'm very confident that Brazil, will take that opportunity to be bold on that. The second is on climate finance, which is a discussion that's being very much around the quantum, not the quality. And I think now we have, with the G20 particularly, a very good opportunity, to have a more structured conversation and move beyond this, global south, global north thing, which I think it's really outdated when, some of the global south actors in the convention are petrostates with a lot more money than many of the global north players do. And finally, on tipping points, we are facing the risk of tipping point in the Amazon. And of course, we are concerned with all others, right? The Atlantic, the Antarctica. So I think this conversation about how we build policies at international, but also at national level to deal with the tipping points can also be part of Brazil's presidency of COP30.
So, and I am going to touch on something that Ottaviano said. I think because Brazil is a petrostate, it's one of the most resilient petrostates because oil is not the one and only thing in Brazil. It does have a national company that is regarded as a very competent national company. Therefore, how petrostates and national companies navigate the energy transition is of utmost importance for many reasons, including geopolitics and the survival and immigration issues, whatnot. So how does a national company do that? It also is by financing the energy transition itself, either by doing it itself or by financing the private sector, putting its balance sheet to become and create markets. So for example, in Latin America and many other places, the largest the demand for hydrogen comes from refiners. So one way in which the oil sector can really help the green hydrogen transition, which requires markets that do not exist, is by becoming themselves the off-taker, by taking the risk of developing this. So there are many ways in which Brazil and its competent technocracy and states can do that. That's one, the national company. But the other thing, and climate finance is a very, very good example, is investing in green energy technologies in emerging markets is very risky for a variety of reasons. But Brazil also has a development bank, BNDES, which is innovating in the concept of blended finance, which blended finance, what it does is that it tries to de-risk the private sector so that it provides that catalytical finance so as to significantly increase the availability of finance from the private sector, because the energy transition is going to be very costly and most of it has to come from the private sector, but it's not going to come from the private sector unless we start de-risking somehow the projects. And so one example that Brazil is doing, and it's very interesting, the things that are happening in those concepts of blended finance and of using the balance sheet of state-owned companies, which are everywhere in emerging markets, as also part of the way you finance the energy transition.
And that's very interesting. The biggest state-owned oil companies are continuing to expand oil and gas production, including Petrobras.
Yeah.
That is not exactly the shift that was agreed to at
Yeah.
COP28.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm actually going to touch on that point.
I'm going to come back to that at the very end. Okay. But it seems to me that one thing to keep in mind about Brazil's role in the world is precisely that it manages to talk to a lot of different powers, right? In a multipolar world. Its relationships with Moscow and Beijing and Washington, there are open channels there. So that makes it interesting. That makes it an interesting player in climate diplomacy, particularly if there's a change in administration in the US later this year. I think we're going to take the last question from the hand there.
Hi there, Elliot Waldman, Point 72. When we talk about deforestation in the Amazon, a lot of the agricultural products that are grown, raised on illegally deforested land are bound for export markets overseas, including pretty significantly here in the US. Curious to what extent you think there's potential to address that issue on that demand side through things like tighter regulations, closer monitoring of supply chains, or is that just too impractical of an approach?
Well, the EU certainly has taken that approach.
Yeah.
And deforestation and supply chains are going to be looked at much more carefully on some key crops.
Yeah, but there's an important point here. When you look at the big players in the agribusiness sector in Brazil, the really big exporters, those are not the ones doing Amazon deforestation, including because of where they're located. I mean, they're located in the Cerrado, most of them. The ones that are doing that are doing these activities and sort of going more and more into the Amazon are the smaller producers that don't necessarily produce for export, but instead produce locally. And there, there's an issue that really does need to be addressed. The Amazonian states in Brazil are the poorest states in the country, by far. And you need to resolve the issue of poverty if you're going to address this particular issue head on. Unless you address the issue of poverty, this isn't going to be addressed. And you're still going to have these activities taking place still at the margins of the Amazon, which are growing more and more inward because the outward stuff is already gone. The periphery is already gone.
Natalie, do you want to add to that on the demand side?
Very quickly, I think there's been a good number of initiatives in the US looking at demand. One is the Forest Act, which is being considered by the US Congress at the moment. There are some other ideas floating, and I think, there's good collaboration. And of course, since the UK and the EU had set the tone on this matter, not talking about illegal deforestation only, but also considering legal deforestation. I think the US and even China is considering working on the demand side. So the trend is there. And of course, Brazil, especially the Brazilian government and the Brazilian diplomats, they hate this discussion. They don't want more countries, more regions, enacting barriers, because these are barriers. But still, I think it's a movement that it's unstoppable, and we're probably going to see more and more, measures like this. And finally, as you probably know, the EU-Mercosur agreement fell apart for many reasons, but one of the contentious issues was exactly, this collaboration / competition around agricultural products, and the way that the EU wanted, to insert clauses on tackling deforestation. So deforestation and trade are super connected, and we're going to see more and more action in that space.
We are going to end on time, not only because this is the Council on Foreign Relations, but also because there's a cocktail party after. So last question to you three. Lightning round, please. Just really a yes or no, maybe one sentence. Is it possible that Brazil can demonstrate by COP30 a plan to phase out fossil fuels in a just and orderly manner?
I can respond. I can
Yes,
say
please.
absolutely. I can say possibility is there. Absolutely, yes. But we need to really open more and more space for that to happen. It's not guaranteed. We are actually not even, considering this seriously at the moment, but yes.
To me, this is the wrong question. This is not about Brazil decides one day it doesn't produce more oil. If there's demand next to you, it doesn't change anything. Somebody else will produce it and actually produce it worse. Brazil is not where you have the highest emission barrel. It's actually one of the countries that produces the lowest emitting barrel with low methane emissions and does it in a way where it captures the carbon. So I think the point is, how can we phase out not production, demand? That's where we need, because if not, if you phase out production without facing demand, guess what? Oil prices are going to go to 150. So this is a demand issue, not a supply issue. The supply will adjust once the demand is gone. I'm actually worried that what it means for emerging market and developing economies, an oil price that goes to 150 before it falls. So for this to be orderly, it needs to be demand driven, because if it's supply driven, it's going to lead to significant increase in price like we saw with Russia. And so to me, what is important is, okay, we're going to have oil for a while. So every single barrel of oil, every single molecule of gas needs to be the least methane emission intensity and the least carbon intensity. That's how I think we should think about this. But scaling renewables as fast as we can.
And every petrostate will compete to be the last one standing.
So I'll address your question from a sort of climate goal perspective, because Luisa has done such a wonderful job answering from the fossil fuel side. Can Brazil achieve its climate goals, or what it sets out for it by 2030? Yes, but there's the big political obstacle to overcome. And we need to remember that there's going to be an election in the middle of that process. There's an election in 2026. And depending on which way that election goes, then yes or no, that's going to be, in the end, the answer is very much going to depend on that.
Thank you all very much for being such a great audience. And thank you to all of you. Thank you.